Hi there, folks. My name is Andy McVay. I'm the winemaker for Dobbes Family Estate, and I'm here joined by James Cassidy. James, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is James Cassidy. I'm an instructor of soil science at Oregon State University, and I also run the student farm there and work in the soil physics lab, and I'm the president of the Oregon Society of Soil Scientists, and I have a lot of credibility.
And we're going to get down and dirty and talk about soils today. We're going to talk about the history of soils in Oregon and the Northwest. We're going to dive deeper and deeper and deeper and more specific and try to make this as user-friendly as possible. The world of soils is even more complex than the world of grapes, believe it or not. And we're going to try and make this as digestible as possible for Oregon soils and Oregon wine and our growing regions and how they vary.
But first, we're going to talk about soil, and it's all about soil. I mean, everything's about soil. Not just wine, not just food, but everything. Every atom in your body was once inside of a rock that dissolved out of that rock and was taken up by a plant that lived in soil, and then you ate it. And that's why you're here, right? But we're talking about Oregon here, and Oregon is an amazing place to study soils because we have some of the most diverse climate, geology, and soils. And in fact, I have a prop over here.
A little visual aid.
So, not to get all down into this, but there are 12 different soil orders, and there are 20,000 different named soils. So wherever you are, you're on a soil that has been described. And most people, of course, never think about any of this. But all these different soils, we call them soil series, and everywhere you are is a different kind of soil. And then all of those 20,000 different named soils belong to one of the 12 soil orders. And these are really different soils, right? Different types. And we've got tropical soils and very young soils and very dry soils. We have all organic matter soils over here. These are histosols, and vertisols are very clayey soils, etc. And the cool thing about Oregon is in Oregon, we have 10 of the 12 soil orders are in Oregon. You can find them in Oregon, which is unique in the country. There is no other state that has that kind of diversity at that scale. And so, probably 80% of the soil types are found or something very similar to that in Oregon. I have a map here of the general map of the soils of Oregon. This is a really cool old poster. It was made in 1983 by a guy named Thorson, really. And all these different colors represent basic different kinds of soils. And so here's the Willamette Valley. But you can just by not even really knowing anything about soil, you can see how diverse this state is. And it's because it's really dry over here. There's volcanism here, like high cascades of active volcanoes. Here's the coast, the Pacific coast. This is uplifted marine sediments with all sorts of volcanics embedded into them. And here's the Willamette Valley. Here's southern Oregon, very different wine growing region. And this is the Columbia Gorge, which has famous wines here too. So you can just see all that diversity. And the diversity that we see in Oregon is reflected in the diversity just in the Willamette Valley alone. There's an enormous amount of diversity. And that's kind of where we're kind of pulling in now. So you kind of have a global view to this kind of state view to where we are in the Willamette Valley. And the Willamette Valley is super unique because it's two mountain ranges. One of them is uplifted marine centers. This whole area, in fact, this whole part of the state used to be under the ocean, like 100 million years ago. You remember? And 100 million years ago, it's all under the ocean. And the Juan de Fuca plate is sliding underneath the continental plate, which uplifts this whole part, and it lifted this all up. So these sediments that have laid out in the ocean for millions, hundreds of millions of years were suddenly jacked up out of the ocean. And that's what those hills over there are. If you can swing over, way over there, that's the kind of part of the coast range, I think.
Yep, there's the coast range over there.
Right over there. And then because that plate was slipping underneath of this continental plate, all that friction, just enormous amounts of energy melted the rock, and it came up as volcanoes here. So we have these very active volcanoes here for the same reason, but a very different kind of geology. So in between these two mountain ranges is this valley. And this amazing thing happened about 15,000 years ago. The largest floods ever known to have happened on the planet Earth happened here. Came down the Columbia Gorge. Most of it shot out into the ocean there was an ice dam in Montana at the end of the last ice age, 20,000 years ago. And there was an ice dam that blocked off a river that backed up into a lake that was 500 cubic miles. Don't get me started. This goes on and on and on. But that ice dam broke and it came down the Columbia Gorge and literally gorged this. If you've ever seen the Columbia Gorge, you got to come out and see this. It's insane. It's beautiful. And it gorged this out and 1 million cubic feet per second with boulders the size of buses and high rises in suspension, 600 feet high water, moving at 100 miles an hour. Came out, and most of that shot out into the Pacific Ocean. But right here where Portland is, which is a lovely city, a lot of that turned south and filled up the Willamette Valley to be a giant inland sea. And that water came up to about 400-foot elevation, took about a week to do that. And then it dropped and it went out. And it didn't just happen once, that happened 100 times in a 5,000 year period. 5,000 years, ice dam blocked off the Clark Fork River, 500 cubic miles of water came down, just filled the Willamette Valley, and then it settled out. And that happened 10,000 years, 15,000 years ago. So this valley is just frosted in deep with these special kind of sandy and silty soils that came from thousands of miles away. And that's in between these two mountain ranges, right? And of course out here it's a very different situation. But so where we grow grapes in the Willamette Valley is up on the slopes around. That's this pink here represents higher elevation, and this is the low elevation, this light pink. And so we grow grapes on these slopes for various reasons. So,
right on. And how about the transition in elevation between this light pink and darker pink section?
So basically where this darker pink is, that's above 400-foot elevation or something like that, which remember, that's about as high as that water got. So all of the light pink stuff was heavily influenced by these Missoula flood sediments. And all of these uplands that are higher than 400 feet have more related to the volcanism or the uplift. And so they're very different, what we call parent materials. So soils are made from geologic material, whether that's sandstone or basalt or siltstones, and then they're transformed into soil over time because rocks dissolve in water and stuff lives and dies and lives and dies and lives and dies. And pretty soon you have this thin scum on top of that geologic material that we call soil, from which all life comes from. And it's not a big deal. So, and all wine.
Right on. So rewinding here, we've got this side of Oregon under a big ocean. And then the continental plates push together and jack up and create mountain ranges, and then through that tremendous pressure and heat, volcanoes are formed and erupt along the Cascades.
Right. Now, there's a little story here that we got to talk about, and not to make it more complicated, but remember this was all under the ocean, and those are all these the continent was just draining off all the ancient rivers, all the sands and the silts and the clays that came from ancient mountain ranges that no longer exist, have been like laying out onto the ocean floor and layering and layering and layering. We're talking miles thick of these sediments. And the weight and the pressure of those turn those into sandstones and siltstones and claystones. But every once in a while, there's a hot spot of the mantle that pushes up through that, and there's like a kind of an undersea volcano that cracks up through that and doesn't quite get to the surface of the ocean, so it's not an island. And it cools out. And then more sediments come in and bury it for another 100 million years, and then another hot spot comes out. So there's these blobs of basalt that are hundreds of millions of years old, buried in those sediments. And so that's an ancient story, where this volcanism here is, 40 million years are the oldest rocks in the low Cascades, but currently there are active volcanoes here. So that's a really fresh kind of basalt. These are really ancient basalts peppered inside of these sediments, and those are the difference between those two mountain ranges. And then this chocolate frosting came in here and just filled in the valley, and from the Missoula sediments. And that's why we have this incredible farmland on the valley floor, which is super nutrient rich and moist and awesome for farming, row crops and all sorts of grass seed and stuff, but probably a little too good for growing grapes on. You might be wondering, what?
Well, and the other way to think about it is it's so good for everything else that we grow other things on the valley floor like corn and wheat and grass and blueberries and livestock, and we have plenty more space as a result to grow grapes on the hillsides.
Right, and there's a lot of timber industry that happens in these slopes as well, because they're adapted to pretty nutrient poor conditions. And I'm not going to step on it, but grapes grow a little better, make better tasting grapes where there's a little bit of stress involved. And that could be from nutrients or from lack of water or competition. That's why they plant them so close, right?
The plant can focus more on ripening the grapes instead of just growing tons and tons of foliage. Grapevines grow a lot. And the nice 6 foot, 7 foot tall height that we have here in the vineyard could be 12, 15, 20 foot tall if we didn't stop it from growing up. If it could climb up the trees that are around us that are 30 feet tall, grapes would just keep climbing. That's what they're originally built to do, but we keep them nicely arranged in vineyards. And the lower vigor soils keep the grapes growing a little bit less, keep the plant and vegetation growing less, and more focus on the clusters.
And the reason that is from natural selection, because you got these grapes kind of growing in these stressful conditions, and they have the genetics in them to survive that. And that strategy is to make better tasting fruit, really, so that animals, birds, and other critters will come along and eat them, and eat the seeds, and then poop them out somewhere down in the valley, so that where the good living is for the vines. And then you grow these kinds of grapes in the valley floor, and they just make big leaves and giant vines, and they don't really worry about having, making grapes, because the living's good. And so that is somehow genetically in the memory of all that evolutionary adaptation to stress is still locked into the genetics of these things. And if we can trigger them to bring that out, we get these fantastic fancy wines.
Right on. So we've got a lot of ancient history here. We've got Oregon underneath an ocean, and then tectonic plates colliding, creating mountain ranges. Volcanoes erupt, and some of the lava is stuck underneath the soil, and some of it in a younger area has reached the surface and flooded all over. And when those mountain ranges climbed up in elevation, the ocean drained away, and then we had the Missoula floods come in and fill in the marine sediments and the volcanic rock, and the Missoula sediments filled up on top of that. So we're going to talk generally about 3 types of soil, parent origins or origins, it'll be marine sedimentary, volcanic, and Missoula floods or
and just to come back once again, huge diversity. Can you see that? The diversity of the geology begets the diversity of these soils. Whether you remember all that stuff or not, that's the big picture here. It's a special state, and that's why the wines are great.
Right on.
Yeah.
So let's zoom in and get our hands dirty and talk about some of these soils. So let's instead of working left to right, we'll start on your side and talk about our oldest parent material, the marine sediments.
Well, that's a trick question.
Okay,
of course.
Yeah, it's always tricky.
Well, let's go with that. Let's go with that. So keep it somewhat simple here. I am a soil scientist, so we could go all day on what do you mean by how old? Anyway, so look here. So what this is ancient marine sediments. And so these were little particles of sand, silt, and clay that came down some river 100 million years ago or 200 million years ago and went out into the deep ocean. Imagine the ocean over this. Imagine this is like a mile thick. And here's your deep ocean. And that came in and that laid down. And so then it all got jacked up out of the water, and all the water drained away. And then this is an exposed, fresh parent material. We call that time zero. Okay? At time zero. Now, there's hot and cold, and there's lots of rainwater, and there's all this eating away because the rocks dissolve in water. And slowly, look at there's little bits of rust in it, and I could break this apart even. Look at that. That's no longer a rock. I mean, can you imagine? You couldn't do that if this was just pure sandstone. It would be too hard to do that. But now it's kind of rotted away a little bit because it's been weakened by water and organisms and just all these soil forming factors. And slowly it erodes and it becomes something that looks a little more like we have some samples here. I'll get some of this out of here. So now imagine this stuff. It's a little more, you can see it's more transformed. Look at this, little bits of clay stuck on top of there. There's secondary minerals of iron oxides. And so this is being this stuff is being transformed into this layer, which is above it. Right? Imagine that. And then eventually that even becomes soil on top of that. So that's kind of like a miniature microcosm soil profile of one of these vineyards. Let's imagine this is about 3 feet deep or something. The soil on top down to this rotted parent material down to this less rotted parent material. Because soils don't build up. This is kind of hard to get. Soil processes eat down into parent material. These processes of dissolution and transformations of geologic material are processes that are eating down, and that's all because of carbon from the plants, all these living and dying, and energy from the sun and the biota are speeding that up, and it's eating down into the soil. And so that's kind of what's going on with this. This is called a Willikenzie. Remember we talked about 20,000 different named soils? Google it. Willikenzie soil, super famous wine growing soil. And the reason it's kind of famous is because this stuff doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. It's mostly sands and silts that from 100 million years ago. Look at the color. There's not a lot going on there. So it's kind of a nutrient poor soil, but just enough that these things grow. But under a little bit of stress, they make better grapes and they make better wine.
Right on. So if we don't have
It's live TV, folks.
Marine sedimentary soil, we could have a soil that's derived from volcanic base.
Right.
And we have over here some basalt. Let's learn about basalt. And we talked about how when the tectonic plates came together, they created a lot of pressure and energy, and the energy increased temperatures and turned into lava. And the lava, it didn't break to the surface and flood out over the surface, sometimes got captured within the soil and cooled off. And we have these big plugs of really hard stone, basalt, trapped in the mountains.
That's real rock there, right? It's weak enough that's been weakened. See like it's darker on the inside? Is because this is not seeing the light of day in, hundreds of millions of years, or if ever. And you can see there's different crystals in there, these are nutrients. I mean, every atom in your body was once inside of a rock. Where did the calcium come from you? Where did the iron that's in your blood cell right now, exchanging oxygen and CO2 come from? It came from a rock and it had to be dissolved out in a plant to take it up. And so this kind of rock is really hard. It's called, igneous rock, meaning completely melted and then it cooled. Where this is just a bunch of sediments that kind of packed together and became a rock. So a really different kind of rock. So whether or not it was embedded in the marine sediments or came up out of a volcano, as it does in the Cascades, it's still this kind of rock. And it might be older or younger depending on which of those landscapes it was from, but still, it's just this kind of dark rock. And basically, the darker the rock is, the more important minerals are there that are nutrients, that are important nutrients. But this stuff is super old. So it's weathered away, right? I just want to talk about this Jory soil.
Right on. Yeah, so as the Willikenzie, as the marine sediments decompose, it turns more into smaller pieces and smaller pieces. And if we were to put this into a rock grinder, we'd get a nice, even, silty soil. Mm-hmm. And as the volcanic sourced parent material, the basalt, erodes and decays, it turns into this more friable, what we're more familiar with as soil. And this is a Jory soil.
So this is, I don't even know this, but this is Oregon state soil. That's right. Every state has a soil, and ours is Jory. So look that up. Find out wherever you are and type in state soil. And the reason it's a state soil is because it's very unusual. Number one, that's one of the criteria. And the other criteria is it has to be of agricultural economic importance. That's another function of how we make that decision. In fact, these were the two runners-up for the state soil, was Willackenzie and Jory. But Jory is this red soil. If you've ever come out here and you drive up in the foothills and the uplands, you'll see this just Christmas red soil, right? And so these are really old, 35 million years of this stuff slowly transforming into clays and other secondary minerals. And one of those other secondary minerals is iron oxide, and that's why it's red. So there's a lot of iron oxide in it. And all that's really left is iron oxide and some clays and not a lot of nutrients. Because where did the nutrients go over all the time? They dissolved out of here and ended up in the ocean. And that's why they're sharks. But we'll tell you about that some other time. And so what's left are these rotted, ancient, iron oxide rich soils that are also nutrient poor, but for a completely different reason.
So Jory is a unique type of volcanic soil. There's other types of volcanic soils like Nikaya,
Which is here.
And where would we find Jory most famously in the Willamette Valley?
In the Dundee Hills.
In the Dundee Hills.
I had to remember that.
So they call the region the Red Hills of Dundee, and it's highlighted because of the iron oxide in the soil that makes it have this like rust hued or kind of auburn, burnt orange character. It's reddish compared to other soil types. And when the Willamette Valley was initially being planted, we had some folks who were really interested in planting in the Dundee Hills, partially because of higher water holding capacity, because of that clay component of the soil. It could hold on to water longer, and that could help vineyards get started when we didn't have irrigation initially. So that's another unique thing about the Jory soil is a higher clay content, and it has a higher water holding capacity.
And these types of plants, in fact, most plants, but especially grapes, and we grow a lot of Douglas fir here for the timber industry. I both have these mycorrhizal associations. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there's these fungi that form relationships with roots and blah, 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 in order to extract more of the nutrients, because it's a pretty nutrient poor soil. So they can live here, where you couldn't grow corn up here. I mean, you might be able to get something to come up, but you're not going to be selling on a commodities market, And so there's only certain things that can grow in this kind of soil, and it turns out it's a pretty high value crop.
Yeah, and Dobbes Family Estate works with a vineyard in the Dundee Hills called Dux, spelled D-U-X, and it's a Jory soil location, and it's at about 400 to 500 feet, which is just above, like when we were talking about how Missoula floods came in and hit about 400 feet and then they'd recede, and hit 400 feet and then recede. So on the soil map, we see a transition between Missoula flood influenced soils up into a more volcanic based soil at around 400 feet. And many of the AVAs start around 200 feet, but we have a distinct transition around 400 feet to more volcanic soils that show like this.
And these soils can also be above the 400-foot line. They're just less likely to because they're generally lower elevation. But there's a bunch of them that are above 400 feet. Do you think this one is?
Yeah. This is from a vineyard called Crawford Beck in the Eola Amity AVA, and the vineyard ranges between 400 and 500 feet. And sure enough, these samples were taken from the lower portion of the vineyard around 400 feet, and the volcanic influence is higher up in the vineyard, closer to 500 feet.
Well, we didn't even plan that. Look at that. See, we're not good. So
that's improvisation.
That's right. So then there's this one we want to talk about.
Yeah. So what is Loess?
Right.
I think I would emphasize, I would call this Loess, but a lot of people run it together and call it Luss, like Luss is the phonetic way to describe it.
It depends on where you got your soil science degree. On the East Coast, they call it Loess, and here they call it Luss, because it's Oregon. It's just different. And now this is a soil type called Jory. It's a soil series. It's one of the 20,000 different named soils. Willackenzie, also soil. It's a series. There's one of 20,000 different ones that belongs to one of the 12 soil orders. Where this one, we're not exactly sure what the soil type is by name, but we know that it's a loess. And what that means is it's a wind-blown sediment. So Whole new category. Sorry, super
So
diverse.
this can be blown by the wind?
No, it has to be really.
Okay. This can be blown by the wind?
No, it has to be ground up.
Something different, something lighter.
Right. And where did that come
Oh.
from? It came in on the Missoula floods.
Okay.
So, like boulders the size of buildings were ground to dust in the Missoula floods. There are waterfalls 400 feet high where there was never a river because that's where just slabs of water were grinding soil. 400 feet thick. Imagine 400 feet thick of this stuff. But it's just billions of tons smashing down, just turning this into dust. And that all got into suspension and went down the Columbia Gorge and came to the Willamette Valley and filled it up to 400 foot elevation. And all that sediment settled out, and then the water went away. And then it happened again and again and again, and it filled in a deep valley with just this very fine sand, silt, and clay soils. Then the winds blows because everything was buried. There was no trees, there's no nothing, and it's dry here in the summer. It doesn't rain usually until November here. It ends in June and doesn't rain until November. And so that wind blowing, all this stuff, you can see it just blows away. Here, I'll show you a little. Yeah. Okay. Right? It blows away.
Wind blown.
There it goes. And it blows up on top of these sometimes. So that can complicate the story. We're not trying to complicate the story. But there is this type of influence, the wind-blown Missoula sediments. And what elevation did you to capture this at?
So this is at about 250 feet.
So this is the Missoula flood sediments that have been blown around, but the original sediments came in our water, and then this stuff can blow up into higher elevations, and that's probably why there's any nutrients up here at all, frankly.
And the Willamette Valley, Oregon has a newer AVA called the Laurelwood Ava. It's what's been subdivided out of the Chehalem Mountain AVA, and on the north and east exposures of the Chehalem Mountains is this area called the Laurelwood Ava, defined by this wind-blown silt called loess. And that's this soil specifically came from Dion Vineyard outside of Cornelius, and it's around 250 to 300 feet. And these silts would have blown up onto the slopes and have variable impact. As the higher up in elevation you go, the less likely we are to come across windblown silts, or the more easy it is for the windblown silts to go up and then be washed back down.
Yeah, and just in case you're wondering, these are actually little what are called aggregates, and you can crush them. And this is a very, very fine. You can crush one of these and feel this, and crush it until it's completely powder, and then just feel it between your fingers. Do you feel how silky smooth that is?
Super smooth.
It's just incredibly smooth. Right?
I think that we should get a little bit of water and do a little bit of masking afterwards. Make sure our skin is taken care of.
It's really awesome. We'll do that after, because we're gonna have a glass of wine later, as you can imagine. So, or two. Look at that. Loess. There it goes. There it goes on its endless journey. The endless journey. Long after we're all gone, these processes will still be going on. There'll still be grapes probably growing here in 500,000 years. It's still going to be the Willamette Valley.
Survival of the fittest.
Yeah. Well, the grapes will outlast us.
Yeah, the grapes has been hanging out for a long time.
Yeah.
Right on. So we've got this side of Oregon covered in an ocean, and those marine sediments formed a base layer of a lot of important things.
Right.
And then tectonic plates crashing together and driving up mountain ranges, creating tremendous friction and energy, creating volcanoes and lava, trapping cooled lava into basalt areas. And those marine sediments and volcanic uplifted basalt,
they all weather away into soils.
And we have the Missoula floods coming down to the Willamette Valley, flooding to a 400-foot elevation and draining away, and doing that over and over again. And as the Willamette Valley dried out, we have a very fine level of silt that blew through the wind up onto the slopes and created another layer of complexity in this layer cake of the Willamette Valley.
Yeah. Let's bring him into the sun just so you can see some color.
Okay.
Let's bring him over. You got to see these. And you can really see the differences. Like they can see the iron bands. That's the original deposition of sediments sideways, right? And there's fossils in here. I found clams in this type of parent material. So clams, like that big around. I should have brought one. That I had a paleontologist look at OSU, and he said, he looked at it as an eyepiece. Old guy, he's long gone now. He said, "Oh, that's about 35 million years old. That's a Schnuckelbuckle rock. What he knows the name of the clam because." And so I said, "Where'd you find it?" He said, "Found it." He said, "Yeah, about 35 million years old is how old these sediments are." Then these are these ancient basalts, either from the Cascades recent or the ancient marine intrusions. But then that takes a lot. Look, that's got all that iron because the parent material has a lot more iron in it to begin with, and it dissolves away and creates iron oxides. This too, though, is a very fine texture. You can break it apart.
And I think it's important to point out that Jory has a really distinct red color to it, which is more obvious when you're driving by a vineyard with like every other row tilled. And in this scenario, it doesn't look so red, but when you look at an entire vineyard of it, it's a lot more noticeable. Right. And I think it's notable that this is a little bit more chunky and a little bit larger pieces. That clay content holds moisture better and keeps the chunks together longer than this finer silt,
exactly right,
which shakes apart into smaller pieces easier.
So if you imagine pouring water on this would easily penetrate down into that larger structure and store deeper, where here it might pile up on top and go in and run off. So they have very different ways that the water is moving, how deep it's stored, and it's real. And I'm just talking, I'm making this up a little, but I heard this. It's all about water, how the water is held is the main thing about grapes. And I heard this from somebody who made wine, so I don't know. But it's when it dries out. You don't want it to dry out too soon when they're flowering and all that stuff, but you want that stress to come in at the right time. And that's where these soils are kind of magical in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. In Oregon's growing season, where it can get really dry, having a soil with a higher water holding capacity, not too high. We don't want puddles. We don't want soggy ground that would allow too much plant growth. But we want an easy transition out of a wetter spring into a drier summer. And when you have a higher water holding capacity, it's easier for plants to get a hold when they're younger. And but part of the difference in water holding capacity gives us different wine styles. And I think our next transition here is to talk about how different soils impact different wine styles. And I'll start here just as good as any place. The Ducks Vineyard, which I pulled this Jory sample from, is in the Dundee Hills. And I think Jory soil is unique in Oregon because most soils are a mix of a bunch of different parent material. It's rare that you have something 100% one type. Like in this vineyard, we have 4 different soil types. And in Ducks, it's primarily, or the majority, volcanic-based Jory soil. And in the Dundee Hills, which is really well renowned for that type of soil, we have more opportunity to find a wine defined by soil. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on a wine's personality defined by soil, because there's a lot of things that define a wine. We start in the soil, but then we go to the plant, and we're talking about different rootstocks on the plant, different clones of grapes on the plant. Then we get to farming style, whether it's irrigated or not irrigated, the age of the vine,
landscape position.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's on the north, slightly different slope or different direction.
Elevation, orientation towards the sun, age of the vine, trellising type, when the growing season, when the grapes are picked.
Yeah.
And after all those variables, you have what crazy ideas the winemakers are going to do to things, whether they're de-stemming or not. If you have a whole cluster inclusion, that's a tremendous personality on the wine. Whether you're inoculating or you're not, whether you're using extraction enzymes or not, the fermentation temperature that you get to, and the type of container that is able to hold that fermentation temperature. So there's all these variables.
And then whether you barrel age it, what kind of wood you're using, it's just like,
it's hard to draw a straight line from soil type to wine style.
But I'll do it. So,
but
later.
I think when we think about the Willamette Valley in Oregon, and when we think about isolating those variables to draw a straighter line between soil type and wine style, the Dundee Hills is one example where it's easier.
Okay.
And because if you have a more defined soil type, and if you have a less influential style of winemaking with less variables like no whole cluster and a fermentation that goes smoothly without technical flaws. If you can exclude all the things that could distract from a wine's personalities, the things that distract a wine's personality away from soil type, if you control for those, you can draw a straighter line between one style and the other. The Dundee Hills is one of those places, and Jory Pinot Noir grown in a Jory soil without a lot of winemaking influence has the potential to, my experience with it is to have more of a red fruited style of wine, a wine with moderate tannins, and a wine with more elegant acidity. And those things combined generally define a Pinot Noir from the Dundee Hills.
I'm thirsty.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
So
now, what about that?
Yeah,
That's
and
kinda...
Willackenzie. I don't work with many vineyards that are predominantly Willackenzie. It tends to be, I think
earthier, I think, is sometimes described.
Well, darker fruited,
darker fruit,
a little bit more tannin and structure, and but compared to Ducks or a Dundee Hills vineyard, we don't have so many vineyards that are predominantly influenced by Willackenzie, or Dobbes doesn't make single vineyards of those.
So we don't care about that.
But I think, but the more important thing for me here, to talking about wine style in the Willamette Valley, influenced by soil, is we have a variety of soils, and they add to complexity through diversity. A lot of different personalities because of a lot of different reasons. And I think many wines don't need to be defined by one soil type, but if they're influenced by a bunch, that's great. And most vineyards are that way anyways. And when we take a step beyond soil types and look at the broader culture of a growing region, like an AVA or American viticultural area, and look at wines from the Eola-Amity Hills or the Dundee Hills or the McMinnville AVA, then we can draw sometimes simpler generalizations or personality styles. And that's where, like, the Dobbes Family Estate Eola-Amity Cuvée is a blend of multiple vineyards grown on sites with multiple soil types. And the McMinnville AVA, the McMinnville Cuvée, is a blend of multiple vineyards grown on multiple soil types. And we get some easier to compare wine styles from those growing regions.
So what I'm hearing is that this diversity that we have in the state, but specifically in the Willamette Valley, allows the winemaker a broader palette to choose from, to making all sorts of cultural decisions about what kind of wine they want to make, whether they want to limit them, kind of do the pure soils expression or whatever.
Yeah, and I think a super cool thing about the Willamette Valley is we have all these soil types, but we have predominantly one red wine style, Pinot Noir. And
that's because of climate primarily.
Yeah, because it's a cool growing region and Pinot Noir has taken its hold. It's not that other grapes couldn't do well here, but Pinot Noir has taken a hold. And the great thing is that when you set up an experiment, you need some controls. And Pinot Noir is like our control because it's the red wine that we're going to compare in a bunch of different soil types. And the soil types are our variables. So when you come to Oregon and you try Pinot Noir, you get this tremendous experiment and experience to see Pinot Noir grown in different soil types and learn about how they've influenced it. And Oregon is unique within the United States.
Right.
It's and the Willamette Valley is unique within Oregon to help capture the unique character of the soil through one grape to make a bunch of different styles of wine.
Excellent. Should we look at these things?
Yeah. You know what? We need to talk about where we are in the growing season. So we're going to zoom in here to the grape row.
I mean, to the soil type here. Look at this. What is this, Nicaea here? Look at this stuff. Yeah. See the luster? You can see the wind blowing. Dark and red. Okay, talk about grapes.
Okay, so
it all comes from the soil. Okay, go.
Right on. In the growing season, we've had bud break in the first half of April, and then we grew a bunch of foliage. And then in the first half of June, we got into bloom. And before these were little BB-sized berries, they were tiny little buds, and they opened up and created a blossom, and the pollen fertilized each of the potential berries. And we're about 10 days, 2 weeks downstream of bloom. Easy bloom is when the flowers open and get pollinated, and that pollinated flower turns into a berry. And so now we're in the beginning of July, and we have fully formed clusters. And the next stage in the growing season will be veraison, or color change, which generally happens in the first half of August. And right now, as far as growing seasons go, we're pretty warm. We got through some 100+ degree days in the end of June, and now we've been hitting solid 80-degree days, and we're looking at getting into some 90 degrees days. So as far as a growing season, 2021 is showing to be a warmer growing season than average.
How will that affect, do you think, or what would you predict that will affect the control of Pinot Noir?
Yeah. So if we and we're talking about Oregon, so things are bound to change. But if we maintain this warm, and dry, we'll likely have an earlier harvest. So as far as harvest goes, Oregon can harvest Pinot Noir anywhere from the last days of August to the beginning of November. So that's a huge swing based on warm growing season, which most of the harvesting will happen in September, to a cool growing season, which would be later October into early November on the extremes.
Of course, there's microclimates and different.
Yeah, because cooler growing regions and higher elevation all have to do with when we harvest grapes. And crop load also, higher yields will ripen a little bit more slowly. But as far as this growing season, if it stays warm, we'll likely be harvesting more in September than more in October.
And how will that affect the character? Do you think it'll be more concentrated flavors because the fruit will be a little smaller and that sort of thing? Or?
Well, it'll be interesting to see how the size of the berries work out on this vintage. In 2020, we had a lot of chicks and hens, small berries, little big berries, and the small berries have more concentration. But I would say from a warm growing season, we would talk about riper earlier and maybe more ripeness. Like sometimes in cooler vintages, we're struggling to get to optimal levels of sugar, so you'll have higher acid and lower alcohol. In a warmer growing season, you get into ripe fruit pretty quickly, and we'd likely have generally higher alcohols, so like on the higher end of 13 and the lower end of 14, rather than the higher end of 12s and the lower end of 13. So in a warmer growing season, we could get into the upper 13s, low 14% alcohol, and sometimes a little bit less acid, and riper fruit flavors, sometimes darker fruit flavors. Lower sugar, higher acid style of Pinot Noir tends to be more red fruited, and riper styles are darker fruited. So we could have more of a darker fruited, less acid, higher alcohol style of wine. Broadly speaking, about a warm growing season. There's going to be exceptions in the cooler vineyards and higher elevation sites.
So take a note, 2020, you got to buy largely and sock it away and drink and never forget this moment.
Every vintage is worth collecting, and every vintage is worth digging into the nitty gritty, because especially from Oregon, because we have so much complexity and diversity, and you get a lot of that when you come here. So we need to make sure to make the trip out to Oregon and see all of that. Did we cover enough about soil today?
Probably too much.
Probably too much. But also probably not enough. So if you're intrigued by this, you need to send James an email. You need to send me an email, and we'll send that out. We'll send you that digitally, and we can keep talking about it, because this is meant to be just an introduction. Hopefully you're super excited about soils and why they influence wine and how they can influence wine.
And please come out to Oregon and we'll take you around and you'll see this stuff. And it's super nice here, okay? It's like a beautiful climate any time of year. And the wines are all very accessible, lots of small wineries. There's like 800 wineries or something in Oregon. And go over the mountains and see what they're doing, and go down south. I mean, it's an amazing place if you're interested in wine. I'm kind of guessing you are, so.
Right on. Thank you for being interested in soils and wines and vines.
Yeah.
And we look forward to sharing more about viticulture and enology with you.
Right
Cheers.
on, man.
Right on. Thanks, James.
Let's go have a glass of wine.
Bye-bye.